Accepting the shitness of isness is what makes isness not shit anymore. Need to clarify what we're actually talking about when we say non-duality, and then realizing non-duality and mystical states of mind. They're turning out to be quite distinct, separate things. What is non-duality then? So, there's a thing called the 7 Hermetic Principles. And number 1 is mentalism. It's the idea that everything is mind. Is that everything is mind? Okay, yeah, everything exists within mind. But we haven't really gone and discussed what is mind. It could be difficult to pin that down. What do we mean by mind? If we say everything is mind, what do we mean by mind? Or what do we mean by everything? Saying isness, so what is, and what is your current experience. That's everything. And we're saying that is mind. So the current situation that's happening is mind. Now, there is only now. Now, we're saying that is mind, using terminology of number 1 from the 7 Hermetic Principles. Within that, you're saying there's a duality. And duality splits everything into kind of opposites. So hot and cold, good and bad. But they're sliding scales and they're mutually dependent. So the concept of God depends on the concept of bad for its existence. And then something can't be said to be completely good and completely bad. It's like a sliding relative scale. So there's 2 things about the duality. Is that each end of it is mutually dependent on the other. And it's usually not binary. Like you can go from light to darkness and there's all gradients in between. So the 7 Hermetic Principles are saying everything exists within mind. And the mind is everything and the isness. And then later on it's saying, oh, by the way, within this, there's a duality. One of the key dualities, the main duality, object-subject duality. So when we're saying it's a duality, we're saying that the object is the thing being perceived, and the subject is the perceiver. And the things that can be perceived are either physical or non-physical. So you can perceive an object, or you can perceive a thought. But whether you're perceiving an object or a thought, that's still the object. And there's still a subject perceiving it. One exists with the other. So maybe you could think of it in a way that one conjures up the other. So the subject exists in relationship to the object. So it only exists along with the objects, and vice versa. The objects of your consciousness, which are everything that's in the isness, including thoughts, emotions, actual physical objects, are the things being perceived by the subject, and they exist in relation to the subject. Difficult to say where the object ends and the subject begins, because this subject is kind of this single point in the middle in a way that's aware of everything, but at the same time it can't really place its location. It just is there. And so is the object. It just is there at the same time that the subject is just there, which is probably why we're saying this term of isness. So the duality that's described within the 7 Hermetic Principles is describing that duality and the other dualities. But that one's the most important one because it's the duality of isness. And isness is what's happening. It's what is. And there's something like Eastern spiritual traditions is going to start you along a line of inquiry where, for the sake of clarity, they're going to get you to pay attention to isness and have a look to see what's going on, and point you towards the idea that we just described. That there's a seer, perceiver, or an awareness there, and it's aware of the stuff. And that traditional approach is to say you should be identifying with the seer, not with one of the aspects of what is seen. One of the aspects of what is seen is your thought processes and the feeling of this ego. They're going to say, like, you have to separate the ego from the seer and realize that you're the seer and not the ego. But the ego is not such an easy thing to define. It doesn't fall so neatly into the dualist object-subject. Because in the object and the subject, everything which is not the subject is the object. So would the Eastern tradition then be saying that the ego is just the object? The ego isn't actual physical object, is it? Well, no. The ego clearly can't be defined in relation to the trees. Or is it? Or maybe there's like a super ego. So what is the ego then? It's not the physical objects, it's the metaphysical objects, the thoughts. So the thoughts that remember each other and reference each other and keep your kind of continuity of having a structure to your mind and knowing a language and remembering who you know and then thinking about thoughts and then having thoughts about those thoughts. Can you then say that all that stuff makes up an ego? Like your character. And your character thinks that it's itself. It thinks that it's that. This is the kind of traditional teaching. The traditional Eastern thing is that you've been associating with that set of thought processes, which are a subset of the world of objects, as opposed to the subject. And what you should be doing is placing your awareness or resting or residing within the awareness, which in this model is the subject. You're saying that, like, you've got to be more associated to the subject than the objects. And if you're sitting there, then you can essentially have something like a state of no mind, and then that's a bliss state, and you're enlightened. If you can live from that point of view. So that's the kind of the general idea. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff about, using the word transcendental ideas. You're transcending shit reality and going into good reality, better reality, blissful reality, at the higher state. So in summary, the teaching is realize the separation between awareness and the ego. Disregard the ego as a false version of yourself. Associate more to the higher version of yourself, which is the awareness. And you can, if you reside within that and have enough gaps between thoughts, you can experience a no-mind state. And that's equivalent to an enlightenment. But we started off with the Hermetic principles idea, which is a more abstract idea, that there's mentalism, the mind, which I define now as isness. And then another principle is dualism. And then within that, we've said that within the isness, there's an apparent duality because the object-subject idea. So it's similar to what the Eastern thing was saying about the awareness experiencing reality and but falsely associating with the ego, or the ego falsely associating with itself. But in the dualism of the seven hermetic principles, as we discussed, the object contains all of the metaphysical and physical. It contains everything. And the subject is just the mechanism which is aware of everything that's in the object. And then we're saying that that principle exists within the framework of an overall concept of mind, so that everything kind of can exist within the mind. Everything is mental. And that mind is like the universal mind. That is everything. The mind contains, from this perspective, the objects and the subject. And that's the duality within it, that the objects are experienced via the mechanism of subject. So those are the two kind of very abstract ideas. And then you've got a further idea, which is kind of comes along as kind of an extension to the Eastern philosophy idea. That after the so even though we've been discussing about associating more or residing within the awareness, this non-duality idea comes along and says, oh, but actually there is no duality really. It's non-dual. So the object and the subject are actually the same thing. It's a oneness. There's only an isness. So we say from there okay. That's what we was originally talking about, isn't it? With the seven hermetic principles, that we were saying that there's a number one concept which is called mentalism, but essentially you can say it's isness. It's the experience that's happening. It's what exists. It's reality. The number one is like reality exists. It's called mentalism because it exists within the universal mind. And then we're saying one of the principles, sub-principles in there, is dualism. But we're already kind of, at this point, identifying it as a sub-principle. We're saying that duality is one of the constructs of this universal mind, and it allows it to exist. So you can have like a left and right and up and down. It's like gravity. It hangs everything together from a physical perspective, and it also hangs thoughts together in a metaphysical perspective. But we know already from principle number one that everything exists as an isness. Anyway, so principle number two doesn't detract from. Number two doesn't detract from that. Saying that everything is a oneness, and within the oneness, the expressions can be had. Yeah, so you've got that same model. On the surface, then you're just saying, okay, the non-dual idea is just remembering that the duality exists within the oneness. But what's that telling me about the duality? It's telling me that it's inherently an illusion because there's a oneness, but it is the only way of experiencing reality. And then from that it's the only way of experiencing reality, subject-object, which implies that there's always the subject there if you're experiencing reality, which implies that the seer is always seeing objects, or the subject is always seeing objects as its mechanism for actually being aware, which implies that one of those can't exist at the same time without the other. So you can't have the objects without the subjects, or the subjects without the object, because it's a duality. And this is the key point I'm trying to get to, is that they're going to exist at the same time. So as long as there's a object, physical or non-physical, to be observed, there's a subject observing it. If there's no subject observing it, it doesn't exist at that moment. But the subject is always observing it, otherwise it's asleep. And in the Eastern ideas coming along and saying, for its main teaching, disassociate from the content of the object and associate more with the subject, which is something that can help you to see that the ego is not as much under its own control as it thinks. It can help you to detach. But what I don't think it's telling us is that there's a no mind state that you can move into, which is the bliss state. That's where the confusion is. It's like, is there a realization you can have, whether it's just a logical realization or some kind of energetic shift? Is there a realization that you can have, one of those two things, that can put you into a state of no mind, which is like a mystical consciousness? When we're talking about reaching or having an awakening, well, are we talking about just becoming more detached naturally through being a mature person and having some levels of acceptance, detachment, kind of a solid, truthful understanding of self, a sensible grounding in actual reality? Or are we talking about entering into a mystical state where this state that we are, if we are talking about the second state, this kind of mystical no mind state, how does it fit into the non-dual stuff that we've been talking about? The non-dual stuff has been saying there's always an object and a subject, and that in duality, and the subject exists alongside the object, but they're actually the same thing, so the isness. And the idea is that you kind of realise that there is more of a isness. The awareness, the subject in that model, is not a no mind state. It can't exist without mind, without thoughts, without objects. It needs objects to exist. So going back to the Hermetic principles, when we've got the mentalism as the number one principle, and in the duality, and then within the duality we've got object and subject, and then we can see that they're two halves of the same coin. No, two ends of the same idea. One exists, the opposite ends of the same concept. They're both the mechanism for the other one to exist. But in Eastern meditative ideas, kind of injecting this additional thing that even though we're saying that the subject is the opposite end of the object, and those both exist within a oneness, it then kind of makes this weird tangent and says, but you can reside in a no mind state, which is one level above. Now in the Hermetic principles, that one level above is the mentalism, which is the everything. So from that perspective, you're saying that you can reside in the isness, which is where you're just kind of like cool with the fact that there's an object and a subject, and you're not really differentiating between the two. You're experiencing reality as it hits you, just normally, but we understand that the actual experience of reality is as the subject. You've come to the conclusion that actually, yeah, this reality as it exists is the normal reality. I experience it as a subject, but you have to experience it as a subject, even though it can be argued that the subject and the object are illusions. Yeah, so I think the confusion comes is because it feels like the traditional Eastern tradition, the regular Eastern tradition, which is encouraging you to associate with the awareness state, is giving you the idea that the awareness state can exist on its own, and then it would be a no mind state. But the awareness isn't a state. The awareness is just the opposite of the thing that you're aware of. So I'm hearing this stuff about a contentless awareness. And what I'm saying is, yeah, I'm hearing about a contentless awareness, as if now we're saying that the awareness is the isness. Like the awareness is the overall thing. So then we're not talking about, if we're taking that model, we're not talking about non-duality anymore, are we? We're saying that you can go from ego consciousness to awareness consciousness, and they're two different states, and you can't even know about awareness consciousness. It's magical, it's got no faults in it, it's bliss. And then there's all this stuff about the gurus like trying to explain what it means to people, and they can't really explain it. But non-duality is not talking about anything to do with that stuff. Non-duality is actually saying, no, like, you know, this reality that you're in right now, it's true that you can divide it, philosophically speaking, into object and subject, and you're experiencing it as the subject. But really, the object and the subject are just two sides of the same coin, codependent with each other. So you, in a way, you are the isness. You are the combination of the two, which is all that is happening at the same time. Within that, focus a lot on the outside world or the inside world, but it's all subject stuff. It's either you're either focusing on your thoughts and feelings, or other people's thoughts and feelings, and the objects outside of you. Like, it's all the same. It's all part of the isness, and the awareness, in a sense, from that perspective, is the stuff that it's aware of. That's the model. It's saying that the object and the subject, they have to have each other at the same time. If one of them goes away, the other one goes away. So that's why it doesn't fit in with the idea, like the mystical idea of the no mind state, because all that can really mean logically is that there's no object, and if there's no object, there can be no subject. So then you'd say, like, from that point of view, like, you wouldn't remember. Like, there's no subject because there's no objects. You're saying the contentless or no thoughts. So there's no object. And remember, this model is very, for me at least, is very strict about the fact that the object and the subject are a duality. They have to go together. You can't say that, oh yeah, they're a duality, but then this one's the real one. This one half of the duality, the subject part of it, is the real thing. No, you say that you can transcend both of them into nothingness, and the nothingness is essentially the mentalism of the seven hermetic principles. I think, yeah, you could say the canvas, but it's a mind canvas. But the mind is just loosely saying, like, the isness. It's the isness canvas. But you have to start with at least one thing to say, like, yeah, reality exists. It's a problem in science as well, isn't it? It's like, we've got explanations for how everything works after reality exists. So you can say, like, right, we don't know what happened before reality existed. There was a Big Bang. It just didn't exist, and then it existed, bang. It's not a very satisfying answer. And the religious answer is like the same. It's basically saying, well, nothing existed except God. Was God? Well, don't worry about that. But just say that God made reality. Okay, it's the same as the Big Bang one. Nothing existed. What do you mean nothing? Like, nothing existed? Well, just don't think about it too much. But suddenly everything existed, and there was a Big Bang which made it happen. Well, how did that Big Bang? Don't worry about that part. But as soon as the bangs happened, we've got principles for it. We've got gravity and photons and light and mass, and we can measure it all. 7 hermetic principles. Obviously, it's got the same problem. It doesn't know where to start, so it has to say, okay, there's one initial principle just to start everything off. It's called mentalism. Mentalism? Yeah, I mean, don't think too much. It's just to say that reality exists. Because like reality exists and we're looking at it with our eyes, and that's the only way we can really experience it. We're saying that this isness that exists. So we're really saying when we say mentalism, saying the isness that we can see now exists. So just take that. The first principle is that isness is real and it exists. And then you can move on to like within that, in the physical way, so within that, once the Big Bang happens and reality exists, you've got these things, gravity, whatever. And with the seven Hermetic principles, it's scientific in that sense. That saying, well, once you've got mentalism, isness, reality, in that, you've got these things, dualities, cycles, gender, what's that one, as above, so below. You can, if like scientific descriptions of the way that reality works in terms of the way that it's experienced. You're saying there is an experience, that's the isness, that's number one. The mentalism, there is experience, it's isness. And when you look more closely at it, yeah, it's broken down into dualities. You've got the object-subject duality. You feel like a subject, looking at objects. All that stuff lives within the isness. We're back there again, like, and then at this point, you can't then say, okay, but the object and subject within the isness. You can't just say that then like the subject is the isness. So for the seven Hermetic principles thing, you're saying, okay, principle one, mentalism, isness, reality. Within that, object and subject. That's how you can see thoughts. That's how you can experience thoughts, metaphysical objects, and physical matter objects. So it's all objects. Thoughts observed as you can consider them to be objects of your awareness. You can't then say, oh, and you can actually transcend that. The awareness side of that paradigm, the subject side of that paradigm, is the same thing as the principle number one. You can't transcend duality to the... you can't transcend that duality of object and subject to attach to the subject side of that and say that that is the isness. The isness is both sides. It's the object and the subject. It is the isness. So you can't, then you say, well, yeah, that's what I mean. I'm transcending to that. But then that's not the, that's not a faultless state, then, is it? That's just accepting that your current isness that you're experiencing, which is faults, and observing them, or objects that are being observed continuously, is that you're either doing that awake or in a dream, or you're in deep sleep and you don't have any recollection of it or experience of it. And that's when awareness and thoughts and objects, experientially speaking, don't exist. But as long as they're in the isness, that means you're conscious, and the subject and the object has to happen at the same time. You can't only have the subject by itself, and you can't say that the subject is the isness. So you have to like transcend the mind to get to a no mind state. That no mind state doesn't exist within the model. You might be adamant at this point and say, well, I've experienced it. I've experienced a no mind. I've done like I've done all this transcendental meditation. I transcended the mind, and I had an experience of no mind. And what I'm saying is that doesn't fit in to the non-duality concept. It's nothing to do with non-duality, if you're saying that. From those perspectives, this no mind state that you're talking about is just a more, yeah, you might say, a more sophisticated mind state. Those experiences of no thoughts are just long, subtle thoughts. They're kind of, yeah, quiet thoughts. Otherwise you can't experience them. When you say that, like, I'm experiencing no mind states, there's the keys there already. You've answered it with the fact that you're saying you can experience a no mind state. If it's an experience, it's a subject. You're subject to it. You're subject to the experience. So it's the subjects having the experience. And if a subject is having an experience, the object is the thing that it's experiencing. We've already established that. So if you're saying that you can have an experience of a no mind state, it's a contradiction based on all of the previous stuff that's leading up to that claim. So it may well be that you're having a very thinking light experience. The experience that you're having isn't one with all these thoughts that you would have in the obvious way that you would describe like a thinking session, like a big thinking session. Now, I'm going to think things through. Why is it that my bank balance is so low? Oh, maybe it's I went away. This is something that suddenly, and you've got like a stream of thoughts. You're going for that. Like you're just you're thinking about stuff. Or you're daydreaming. Daydreaming, staring off into space. You're aware, and the mind's kind of in a little bit in autopilot, doing its thing. Or you could do like the proper thinking thing I was just talking about, and you're not so much in autopilot. But either way, subject and object is there. And then you say, well, I'm doing the meditation, got the gong going and the incense, and then I'm experiencing these really long gaps between thoughts, and they're definitely not just elongated thoughts. You sure? Like the you sure that's not a thought? And the experience that you're describing, if it's an experience again, there must be a subject, because that subject is subject to the experience. And if, philosophically speaking, or scientifically speaking, if there's a subject, there must be an object. That is what the seven hermetic principles thing is saying. That's what it's for, to describe that. And that's what non-duality is also for, is to describe that. Just to let you know, by the way, you can't experience anything other than the isness. And the isness, once you've got that more, once you've accepted that that's the only thing that you can experience, the isness, which is object and subject combined, if you are experiencing that, you haven't transcended only the object, and you're now living in the subject, the awareness. You've just accepted the object and the subject as they are. Just accepted it as it is. You're like, oh yeah, I am the isness. Yeah, I'm experiencing it as the subject, but I am the isness, obviously. I'm both. And then you're still adamant, like you're having an experience, but there's no faults involved. And that's the bit where you just have to follow my line of thinking now. Because I'm essentially saying, no, you're not having a faultless experience. Or maybe it's a faultless experience, but it's a experience, even if it's only like an energetic experience, right? And you're like dead sure, no, there's no faults. It's just a feeling, or it's just an energy. What I'm saying is the feeling and the energy, they're objects in that situation. And there's a subject that's aware of the thought or the energy or the feeling. There's definitely something which is subject to it. You can't experience without the subject. I was given the example that, like, when you're really into something, it's like time just passes and you're not really there. Like, you're like really enjoying yourself or something, it seems like time flies when you're having fun. Looking back at it, it flew. I agree with that, but at the time when you're at you can't tie that together with like transcendental. For me, you can't say that that's like any kind of proof for transcendental meditation. Because the thing about, if you have an experience where time flew, you get to the end of the experience, like a first date or a roller coaster ride or something, just a really nice day. And at the end of it, you're like, oh, that went quick. But you can remember all of the different bits and pieces. And at the time when you was having the experiences, you was experiencing them, you were seeing other things, and so the subjects and the objects was there the whole time, undeniably. And at the end of it, you can kind of say they was fast. It was fast. It felt fast, right? Retrospectively speaking, look back at it. This time flies thing is like, it's only a figure of speech, really. And I think I've probably heard these people saying like, no, like, because everything. Yeah, you could argue, couldn't you? Like, oh no, because like reality is subjective. It really is going faster or whatever. But like, yeah, it's more of a retrospectively looking back. You can say like, oh yeah, time flies when you're having fun. As soon as you, if you're having fun and time is flying, as soon as you say time flies and you mention that, oh yeah, isn't time flying because I'm having fun? At that point, it's not flying anymore, is it? Right? Because then you're like self-reflective. So it kind of slows down. What you might say is that time appears to be like more slow when you're being more self-reflective. When you're more in the when you're more in the moment, you're saying this is the time flies part, and you can definitely be more in the moment and less in the moment. And that's where we don't want to get. That's where I don't want to get confused. So just then, as I was saying that, as I was doing my sentence, I'm excited talking about this stuff. I freaking love it. So I was talking about it, and I was a bit in the moment as I was talking about it. And the moment consisted of an awareness saying its own thoughts, or you could even say like the moment consisted of this isness that's happening right now, doing what it's doing. So in some ways, philosophically, what's happening right now as I'm saying these words is that it's just happening. The subject, which is the way I experience reality, had the idea that it wanted to say a load of stuff and prove some points and say something. I'm not even sure why. Like, it's just doing that. Put the freaking cell phone in my pocket. Started just going with it. And right now, again, I'm getting into a flow of words, and I'm a little bit losing myself in the moment. And it's really enjoyable to do that. And then there was a pause. Right? That pause was a little bit of a self-reflection part. That pause, I was like, right, thinking about what I just said previously. There's thoughts happening which are weighing things up in my head. What's I saying next? Where am I going with this? Those thoughts are a little bit slower. You take kind of a breath as you're doing them, and they're the more self-reflective thoughts, which are going to course correct the stuff that happened when you're in the moment. In the moment, you can say a lot of stuff, and then you might end up going off on a tangent, and then you might, at some point, have to self-reflect a little bit. So you can think, wait a minute, do I even agree with some of that stuff that I just said? There's loads of stuff I've recorded, and then afterwards I listen back to it, and I'm like, do I even agree with that? I kind of got a little bit caught in the moment there. I won't put that one on the channel. So what I'm saying is that there's slower thoughts that are self-correcting the in-the-moment thoughts, which aren't happening, in a no mind. They're more in-the-moment thoughts. So those are slightly different variations on the way that you're experiencing reality. The course-correcting thoughts, that's the more self-reflective state. One of the ways of living the accepting state, where you've kind of detached a little bit and you're able to even have those self-reflective thoughts. I'm assuming then that there's like some people that are always on the living in the moment. And they don't have the course correcting thoughts, like the more sophisticated, clever thoughts that can see things as they are a bit more clearly, like more realistically. And that stuff, some of that stuff is about the realization that you can have, right? It's not like a non-dual realization as such, but it's just a realization that isness is what's happening, and this is the only isness. Better start just getting with the program and accepting isness for what it is. So I've described the two, like the in the moment way of subject object experiencing itself, and then the slightly more self-reflective object subject, where the thoughts are a little bit more referring to themselves and to the memories. And then there might be another, even more self-reflective version of that, where you're so self-reflective that you're only, the subject is only kind of reflecting on subtle energies and subtle feelings within the body, because we're clearly living in an energetic universe, right? There's feelings and things happening all the time in our body. You can feel aches, pains, feelings, emotional stuff can come up, it can make you cry. There's stuff like this that you can just experience, and there's a subject that's experiencing that, but the experience process means that the stuff that you're experiencing is the object. So even though it might be a thoughtless state, it's still experiencing feelings, energies. So the subject is experiencing the object. So that's why you can remember it. These feelings and energies that you're experiencing are a bit like thoughts, because they're happening, they're objects. So I'm not arguing that you can't have those experiences, but I'm saying that you can't say that there's no, you can't say that the subject that you're getting into at that point is the pure universal mind. The subject in that experience is still the same subject of the normal consciousness experience, the subject which exists relative to objects. Yeah, so I'm saying these experiences are definitely, they're possible. You can meditate and get more accustomed to the inner subtle mechanisms of consciousness, of isness, of what happens. It's like sensory deprivation, right? You actually, in some sense, it's like they use sensory deprivation on prisoners. It's like a torture technique, and they lose their mind a little bit. So you could, it's not trying to like denigrate those experiences, but it does feel like by cutting off sensory input and allowing your thoughts to become very slow, as I was describing before, some stuff's going to happen. You're going to trigger processes off, and then you get those processes that you trigger. You're going to experience them. Okay? So I've not got any problem with all of that stuff, but what I'm saying is that being able to get into that, and then you can label it as a no mind state if you want. Getting into that, that's nothing to do with awakening or enlightenment. It's mystical stuff, and you could probably come out of it with like insights. But the awakening or the realization that we've been describing when we talk about accepting the isness, the end of suffering, that's not getting into this no mind state. it's accepting the normal state for what it is. So it's an interesting thing to do for some people within the context of normal, within the context of the structure of reality that we've defined. No, I haven't defined it. We've defined. The ancients defined. But it exists within that structure. It's not on top of it. There's nothing above isness. That's the whole point. You can't transcend isness. You can just accept isness. It's the accepting the isness, the accepting the shitness of isness is what makes isness not shit anymore. You're not comparing it to any other possible type of isness and saying, oh yeah, there's another universe where isness is much better than this isness. The isness, which is the subject-object paradigm, and you experiencing reality through that, accepting that you don't feel fully in control of it. And there's all these kind of paradoxical acceptances. Like once you accept that you're not fully in control of it, you kind of gain more control of it. And once you accept that you're going to suffer, you have a little bit more detachment from that suffering. We've already talked about that stuff, but the enlightenment is that. And it's not a binary thing. Again, that point again. It's not binary. You're not like just suddenly like, bing, okay, like I've accepted it now. And now I'm like fully okay. It's a gradual process. As I was saying, like, there might be a madman who's fully accepted it. And you like necessarily wanting to go to that point where you have fully accepted it. If you accept it too much, that might not be good. Like you just, as I was saying in the previous one, you literally just don't give a shit. Because the acceptance is kind of saying you don't give a fuck. Like what happens, in a way. Like you're kind of detached from the outcomes a little bit. You get the point. It's like you've accepted it to the point where you don't think that you like the suffering is something that you shouldn't be happening. I already talked about that, didn't I? You not only are you suffering, you think that the like suffering is something that shouldn't happen. I think that's why I'm attracted to the idea of like what the Vikings apparently had built into their culture was this idea of accepting their fate. Feels like a healthy way to live. Like I'm fated to always screw things up, or it's my fate that these things are going to happen, and you can't change your destiny. I think you can experience a healthy suffering within that framework. Now, how to actually have that acceptance, that's another story, right? Because it's easy just to sit here and say it, like, oh yeah, you just have to accept isness for what it is. That doesn't give you any tools for actually being able to do that. And non-duality itself is the same. It gives you this explanation. That's not going to cheer you up, is it? Because it's saying that, like, the object and the subject. Yeah, that stuff about the object and the subject. What are you going to do with that? Okay, yeah, the object and the subject. One. So even though I'm like suffering as the subject in relation to the object, because I am the subject and the object. Isness, I am the isness. I am both. It's all like one thing. There's a oneness. Still suffering, no? Well, how does that help? Like, it's barely worth mentioning. So I'm kind of saying that you have to go through life, and that's why these some of the other non-duality guys. I can't remember that one guy's name, but he's like doing these videos where he's like, "This is not a message for you." He's doing these meetings and he's saying to people, "This is not a message for you. You can't do anything with what I'm saying. You." So when he's saying you can't do anything with what I'm saying, he's saying the subject that's experiencing that message is just a subject within the subject-object paradigm, and you can only ever experience reality via that subject. And that subject, even if it listens to this stuff about non-duality and the isness and the oneness, it can't really do anything with that message. And he kind of laughs about it. And everyone's like, well, there must be something you can do. Like, they're thinking about, yeah, maybe if I can understand this, if I can understand this message that he's saying about the non-duality, and then I can get as awakened as this guy, because he's like laughing and joking and like looks like he's enlightened, and he's saying, but this is not a message for you. You can't do anything with this message. It's like, in a way, he's just like finds it amusing that it's just a concept that the mind, you can't like become enlightened from listening to it. But he's at the same time he's saying like, yeah, he like, just likes chatting about it, and the people in the audience, if they hear it, they can't they can't really use it as a stepping stone for enlightenment. But what they're thinking about as being the enlightenment is probably this no mind state. So they're trying to tie what he's saying together with like transcendental ideas. But he's not talking about transcendental ideas. He's just talking about accepting isness for what it is, which may or may not happen to a subject. It may happen within an isness. Within an isness, you might get to a point where you could say like, "Oh, I've accepted my isness a little bit now for what it is." You always just it's a judgment call on yourself. This guy's obviously thought to himself like, "Yeah, actually, I think I've accepted it. You know what? Like the way I'm living my life these days, I feel like I've accepted it. Like, you know, that's not to say you're enlightened, is it? Like enlightenment, what's that? Is that like when you're like in the no mind state and you're like you got sunbeams coming out of you? No, it's not that, is it? It's an acceptance. It's a detachment. It's just normal consciousness that's like found peace, a certain level of peace. And this is a non-duality teacher, but he's teaching that like you can't do anything to become enlightened. He's literally saying that, like, yeah, I can do this and show you guys everything, but like it's futile. And everyone like is just like keep asking him questions about objects and subjects and stuff like that, and he explains it all. But there's no point in really going round and round in circles with it from that perspective. Now, and that is why I was saying before that the non-dual explanations, you're kind of looking at them after the event. You're saying, oh yeah, like the non-dual stuff. Oh, that kind of explains how I was able to accept. I think that it is generally just a waiting game. You can probably move things along, surely. Like if you spend time living among people that are more advanced, from that perspective, if you're around those types of people, surely, rather than around complete idiots, surely that would accelerate the process a little bit of acceptance. And you're already starting off with a relative level of acceptance, depending on which culture you're built into, or you're born into, and which parents you've got. So everyone's journey is individual anyway. So I think I went for a lot of stuff there, but I wanted to make the point that basically, I don't think that transcendental practices can bring you into a state where only the subject exists. There's always going to be an object in those circumstances, and so those would be whatever those objects are. They might not be like thoughts in the tradition, in the way that you would normally think of a thought, but they're going to be feelings, emotions, experiences. So the subject is experiencing the object. The object is just much more subtle thing, which you can definitely like either train yourself to do, or you can do it with drugs, I'm sure. But that is not an extra level of awakening, enlightenment, or something like that. There is no such thing really as awakening or enlightenment. It's just the acceptance of isness. And again, you only need to try to accept isness if you became aware of it in the first place and thought that something was wrong. Child consciousness, which is a little bit like the in the moment consciousness. When you're in that consciousness, you don't really think about like accepting isness. You're in the moment. Subject is more pure at that point in a way. But if you find yourself self-reflecting in a spiral of despair, you feel like something's gone wrong. Like, hang on, this is not supposed to be like this. Is it me that's broken? Is it the reality that's broken? And that's when the ideas of isness might be a little bit helpful, because you can say, well, actually, the subjects and the objects and the circumstances, and I think you could say, like, it takes the edge off. You're able to accept reality for what it is. Accept suffering.